In November 2012, Australian ex-Prime Minister Julia Gillard proposed a royal commission to investigate institutional responses to child sexual abuse. It covered a range of institutions, including schools, churches, and sports clubs, in a total of 57 public hearings, recording the testimonies of nearly 7,000 abused individuals, around 64% of whom were male, and 10% of whom said it was the first time they'd told anyone about their abuse. There would be testimonies from people like Hugh, who was abused around age 10 by a scout leader, who, after gaining his parents' trust, had him over for parties where boys were plied with marijuana and alcohol and molested. And like Margaret, who was 11 when she was abused at a Salvation Army children's home by a church captain who not only molested children but orchestrated their abuse of each other. To conduct the Commission's investigation, a panel of 6 commissioners was appointed, headed by Justice Peter McClellan, a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales and Assistant Commissioner for the Independent Commission Against Corruption. In May 2015, the Commission began to investigate Case 29 of their public hearings, which concerned responses to child sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organisation. Assisting counsel for the Commission was the formidable Angus Stewart QC. In a video called Concealing Abuse, I looked at how the Jehovah's Witness organisation responded to real-life allegations of child sexual abuse against its members, and how its policies tend to protect the abuser. For instance, even if they fully believe the allegations made against a member, the congregation's judicial and spiritual leaders, known as elders, won't take any action unless there are at least 2 witnesses to the abuse, which is unlikely in view of the private nature of sexual abuse, or the abuser confesses voluntarily, which is again unlikely. Even when these exacting demands are met, justice is far from guaranteed. While the organisation possesses the judicial apparatus to eject molesters from congregations, it repeatedly fails to use it. In a form of excommunication known as disfellowshipping, individuals judged to be unrepentant sinners are completely shunned by all members, including family. But individuals found guilty of molestation can avoid this fate just by apologising. If they express repentance to their congregation's elders, they can simply be reproved. All this entails is an announcement being made to their congregation that they've been reprimanded for an unspecified transgression. And that's it. They'll be left in the congregation, risking further molestation and the constant re-traumatization of the individuals they've abused, who often feel forced out of their own congregation. These kinds of misguided policies serve to protect abusers and punish the abused. Through its in-depth investigation of individual cases, the Australian Royal Commission would expose a daunting maze of unthinkable additional hurdles faced by sexually abused children raised in the Jehovah's Witness organisation. The Commission focused on the experiences of 2 individuals abused by members of the organisation. For anonymity, the individuals were codenamed BCB and BCG. BCB was the first to take the witness stand. She testified to the following account. She was born in 1967. When she was 10, her mother became a Jehovah's Witness and started taking her and her brother to meetings. BCB drifted apart from her father, who didn't attend. At age 12, she met Bronwyn and Bill Neal and became friends with a daughter of theirs. She would attend meetings at their house and sleep over. Mr. Neal discouraged both girls from making non-witness friends at school, based on the idea that bad association spoils useful habits, a sentiment derived from the biblical passage 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. The sexual jokes Mr. Neal started making in front of her would signal the onset of an escalating pattern of abuse. At age 14, when she stayed over with the Neal family, he started inserting his tongue in her mouth when he kissed her goodnight. She would endure these inappropriate kisses for the next 4 years. She felt ashamed and scared, and worried about upsetting Mrs. Neal. But Mr. Neal was an elder, and she submitted to his authority. When she was 17, he intruded on her while she was showering, somehow managing to unlock a locked door. He left when she screamed, "Get out!" but later gave her a vicious belting for making too much noise in her bedroom. At age 18, she was subjected to more overtly sexual behavior. He called her a nymphomaniac and a prostitute. One time, Mrs. Neal caught him tongue-kissing BCB and stopped him, but nothing further was said or done, and his forcefulness escalated, culminating in an incident in which he trapped BCB in the bathroom and violated her, manually and orally. The next day, he entered her room and suggested she'd enjoy full intercourse. She asked him to leave, then packed and returned to her parents' farm. The next year, when he heard through his daughter that BCB had been seeing a couple of boys, Neal invoked his role as an elder to summon her to talk about boys. She felt she had no choice. He took the opportunity to inspect her physically and abuse her verbally. 2 years later, in 1989, having married, she confided in her husband and also in a friend about Neal's abuse. The friend then disclosed this information to someone else. A week or so later, a young elder called Max Hawley approached her to arrange a visit. During the visit, he revealed he'd come to talk about Neal. BCB gave some details, but was too ashamed to recount the bathroom incident. Hawley invited Neal to BCB's house to speak with her and her husband. Despite her discomfort at opening up her own home to her abuser, she did as she was told, on the assumption that Hawley knew the correct procedure. She didn't recall having the purpose of the meeting explained to her, and she felt too inhibited to recount the full details in front of Neal, or challenge him when he suggested his behavior was meant as a joke. Afterwards, BCB approached Hawley and gave him more details. This led to a second meeting, with the additional attendance of one Doug Jackson, a circuit overseer, someone who supervises multiple congregations. His presence and the purpose of the meeting weren't explained. It was just presented as a committee meeting. Neal attempted to blame BCB for wearing revealing clothes, but Jackson said the church didn't accept that excuse. Again, Neal's presence inhibited her, as did being in a room full of men. She said if a female she trusted from the congregation had been there too, it might have been easier. At the end of the meeting, Neal was told to apologize, which he did. BCB was given no explanation of the meeting's outcome or of what would happen. Jackson gave her an article about child sexual abuse, published in one of the organization's magazines called The Watchtower. Not long after this, Mrs. Neal phoned BCB and told her, "Bill didn't abuse you." BCB reported this to Hawley, who said he'd sort it out. Later that day, he phoned and said, "The Neals have asked that you not tell any more people about Bill, out of respect for the family." Scared, disorientated, and unsupported, she did as she was told. It was only years later that she saw the perversity of being asked to respect the man who abused her when nobody had offered her the respect or support she deserved. Weeks later, it was announced that Bill had stepped down as an elder, with no reason given. Nobody talked to BCB about her abuse, and she was still expected to attend study meetings at the Neal's house. She asked not to go there, but was told she had to. Mrs. Neal ignored her. Finally, in 1994, she moved from the area to another congregation. In 2012, she gave a written statement to 2 elders, including one Joe Bello, summarizing her experience in an effort to support the case of anyone else Neal might have abused. 18 months later, Bello visited on an unrelated matter, and BCB told him she was considering reporting her abuse to the Royal Commission. She said Bello later spoke to her husband and said, "You should ask BCB if she really wants to drag Jehovah's name through the mud." BCB was dismayed to find that the burden of Neal's shameful actions had been put on her shoulders. Although she eventually reported her experiences to the Royal Commission, she suffered extreme misplaced guilt about betraying the organization, guilt that manifested in physical symptoms such as chest tightness, heart palpitations, and difficulty breathing. She reported that her abuse destroyed her confidence and self-esteem, and instilled in her a sense of victimhood and a constant paranoia that people were judging her. She went on to experience suicidal thoughts and a nervous breakdown. She said Neil's position as an elder gave him power over her, and suggested that if she'd been allowed to speak to other children outside the congregation, they might have reported her abuse to the appropriate authorities. She suggested a number of changes in the way the organisation dealt with child sexual abuse. She said it should take allegations more seriously and report them to the police, give proper support and protection for children, and not require female targets of male abuse to speak in front of a roomful of men, including their alleged abuser. She also noted that no compensation was offered. The Commission sought to address all of these issues. Max Hawley was the next to testify and sworn in on a biblical oath. Not long into Hawley's testimony, Assisting Counsel Stewart noted that he seemed hesitant in his recollections and asked if this was because of the passage of time, which Hawley affirmed. Judge McClellan asked Hawley if he'd taken notes. He said he might have at the time, but they would have been destroyed. When asked why, he said the elders didn't want their wives knowing what sort of things they were dealing with, and that it was also to protect the person involved and the rest of the congregation, so they didn't have to know about these things. It was not only a deeply patronizing rationale, but a dangerous one, leaving congregations unsuspecting about the molesters in their midst, which is exactly what molesters want. Hawley confirmed that destroying notes remained the current practice. When asked if he was aware of his obligations to tell authorities about serious allegations of sexual assault, Hawley showed no awareness and said he would contact his branch for advice on how to proceed. Unthinking deference to the branch would become a familiar stock response from the elders called to testify to the Commission. Hawley expressed confusion about what constituted criminal assault and later admitted giving no consideration to reporting it to the police. This was an individual invested with the safety and protection of an unquestioningly trusting congregation, a shepherd charged with guarding the flock. But in the shepherd metaphor, Hawley was more like a sheepdog, cluelessly obeying the whistles of an unseen shepherd, who could just as easily direct him to harm the sheep as to protect them. The biblical passage Matthew 18, verse 15, has been cited by the organisation as a basis for requiring abused individuals to confront their abusers with their allegations. McClellan asked Hawley if he realised how inappropriate this process of confrontation was. Hawley said he could understand it now, but hadn't reflected on it at the time, because he was just following procedure. He agreed it could be very difficult for people who'd suffered abuse to share everything done to them in front of their abuser. He said the organisation wanted to keep Neil's abuse as quiet as possible, not to try to cover it up, just to stop the conversation. But almost immediately he contradicted himself, saying they would have tried to keep the matter under wraps. In other words, cover it up. Stewart made the case to Hawley that by directing BCB not to speak to anyone in the congregation, he left her with no one to talk to. Hawley suggested that because BCB was still working in the community, she could have spoken to people outside the organisation. But Stewart pointed out that members are advised not to have close friendships or associations with non-members. Hawley affirmed that was true, but said that whether members took that advice or not was entirely up to them. Many of us who've experienced abusive environments will be familiar with this responsibility-dodging manoeuvre, in which individuals are given clear instructions on what to do or what not to do. Then, when they suffer as a direct consequence of following those instructions, they're told they didn't have to follow them after all, and they're blamed for their own suffering. The fact is, Jehovah's Witnesses are warned in the strongest terms against what are called bad associations with non-members, which they're told will result in disaster. For Hawley to suggest that BCB was somehow supposed to view this merely as a piece of advice she was free to take or leave was disingenuous in the extreme. Stewart put it to Hawley that he was saying two different things. On one hand, saying BCB couldn't speak to people, then on the other, that she could. Hawley claimed he didn't mean to cut BCB off from any support, but admitted he couldn't recall arranging anyone to assist her through the period. Stewart produced a letter from Hawley and the circuit overseer Doug Jackson to their branch office. The letter said, "It appears that a number of brothers know about the matter, And unfortunately, there may be worldly people who also know. Worldly is the derogatory term Jehovah's Witnesses use for non-members. Stewart asked why it mattered if worldly people knew. Hawley said the organisation didn't want anything to detract from their clean reputation. In fact, the organisation is heavily invested in its reputation among outsiders. It seems perverse that it should be so concerned about what worldly people think, considering it despises us as debauched and degenerate, characterizes us as the instigators of broken homes, illegitimate births, and sexually transmitted diseases, and countless other emotional and physical woes, and compares us to what it calls death-dealing polluted air. But, of course, projecting a clean image is what the organisation relies on to attract new members, and it has no moral qualms whatsoever about using deception to try and maintain that patently false image. It even has a formal policy called theocratic warfare that gives members explicit permission to deceive worldly people on the grounds they're not entitled to the truth. I explored the perversity of this policy in my Concealing Abuse video. What that video doesn't mention is a particular exception to the policy, one of special relevance to the Royal Commission. Witnesses are told that when they take an oath to tell the truth, or are placed on a witness stand, they're obligated to speak the truth, if they speak at all. In these circumstances, the only option they have, other than to speak the truth, is to remain silent. It'll become clear that even this rule was flouted by Jehovah's Witnesses during the Commission hearing. It'll also become increasingly clear just how far down in their list of priorities came the welfare of the children they were supposed to protect. Hawley and Jackson's letter about Bill Neal to the branch office stated, "We recommended to him that he step down as an elder, and that he agreed to this." Stewart put it to Hawley that it seemed that they'd offered Neal a chance to step down voluntarily, rather than be forcibly removed. Hawley denied this, claiming it was just an unfortunate choice of words. But those unfortunate words were consistent with BCB's previous testimony that Neal had merely stepped down. In the same letter, Hawley and Jackson added that they felt no further action or restrictions need apply. This meant Neal was free to participate in all the same church and Bible study meetings as before, including meetings at his home, which BCB was expected to attend. The letter went on to make the bizarrely premature recommendation that once the matter had died down, Neal should be recommended as an elder again, so he could help the congregation as he'd done in the past. Stewart asked Hawley if, by the phrase dying down, he meant once the controversy had abated. Hawley claimed that the term dying down was another case of unfortunate wording. When Stewart then suggested that Hawley's prime concern was about Neal's reputation, he initially rejected the idea, but Stewart continued along this line, suggesting that Hawley's concern was about the functioning of his organisation and not about the protection of children in his congregation. Hawley agreed. When Stewart put it to him, his concern wasn't about the support he could offer BCB. Hawley admitted that while that had some bearing for him, it was more about Neal's qualifications to teach. It was a stunning confession. Towards the end of his period in the witness stand, Hawley was given a detailed account of BCB's abuse. He hadn't known about any of it, and said it came as a shock to him. He was asked if he thought the fact that it was only coming to light now had something to do with the process he engaged in when BCB made the initial complaint, a process in which she had to make her allegations to her abuser and an elder who she knew was friends with her abuser. He said he could see the point being made. When it was suggested BCB needed a more nurturing, supportive environment to make a full disclosure, he agreed. But when asked if he had any thoughts on what the organisation should do about it, he reverted to compliant form, saying he had no comments. He just followed the procedures. What came across from many elders called to testify at the commission was that they were so immersed in procedure, they failed to consider the accuser's experience. Doug Jackson's responses clearly illustrated this lack of empathy. When it was put to Jackson that BCB was unaware of the purpose of the meeting she was attending, initially he flat out rejected the idea. But Stewart took some time to remind him that as an elder, he had knowledge not given to the congregation. Knowledge of judicial procedures, standards of evidence, punitive measures. Stewart then asked Jackson if he'd accept BCB wouldn't know about these things. Jackson changed his no to a maybe. Stewart asked if Jackson could see how this lack of transparency would have left BCB in a position of vulnerability and confusion. Jackson said he did now. Stewart repeated to Jackson the portion of BCB's statement in which she was asked in one of the judicial meetings whether she had anything more to tell, and she falsely responded no, because of various inhibiting factors. These included talking in front of a room full of men, talking in front of her abuser, and being afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. Jackson accepted that talking about her abuse in front of a room full of men would have been very hard for BCB, as would talking in front of her abuser. But when it was put to him that BCB didn't feel it was a safe environment, he said he didn't know why she would have felt that, because they tried to comfort her. He seemed unable to comprehend that his supposed efforts to comfort BCB weren't enough to magically overcome all the intimidating factors she identified. Instead of admitting that he had failed to comfort her, his instinct was instead to insinuate that the failure was hers. She had failed to receive the comfort he offered. This kind of mindset is common in high-control groups that deny individuality. Members are slotted into fixed procedures and expected to give fixed reactions. When they don't, the fault is with them, not the procedure. McClellan put it to Jackson that the organization's investigative process inflicted further trauma on BCB. Jackson said he understood that now, but hadn't appreciated it at the time. It's instructive to reflect on the reflex dismissiveness of the elders who testified at the commission whenever it was suggested that the abused individuals in their care felt unsafe or unsupported. Judge McClellan and Assistant Counsel Stewart were two highly skilled communicators. They also wielded the power of the legal system, but even they had to repeatedly spend exhausting swathes of time walking the elders through their own procedures, trying to get them to empathize with the experiences of those abused individuals. If, with their considerable skill and power, they had to work this hard to break through the elders' dismissiveness, what chance did an unskilled, powerless member of a Jehovah's Witness congregation have of making themselves heard? Another elder concerned with reputation was Joe Bellow, one of the elders BCB wrote to years after the abuse, in an effort to protect other children from Bill Neal. Asked about whether he would ever report a matter to the police, Bellow fell back on the mantra-like evasion given by the other elders. He'd contact the branch. Bellow confirmed BCB's account that when her husband had mentioned they were thinking of talking to the Royal Commission, Bellow had asked what that would accomplish, other than dragging Jehovah's name through the mud. It was put to him that this would be understood as a discouragement against going to the commission. He said that wasn't how it was meant. He was just thinking aloud. Although Bellow initially seemed to regret his words and reflected that he shouldn't have said them, he then revealed that he stood by the underlying sentiment. Stewart asked him if, within his faith, Jehovah was considered a loving God. When Bellow confirmed this, Stewart asked if Jehovah would not also then be more concerned about the victim than his own name. Defiantly, Bellow replied, Jehovah would be concerned about the victim, but Jehovah is concerned about his own name too. Judge McClellan asked Bellow if he'd been following the work of the Royal Commission. Bellow hadn't, despite knowing a couple of months previously that he would have to give evidence. He said he might have scanned the headlines of the Saturday paper, but he didn't watch the news or listen to the radio. His complete lack of interest in the Commission's work was abundantly clear, and consistent with the apathy exhibited by most of the witnesses testifying for the organization. Dr. Monica Applewhite was paid by the organization to be an expert witness in its defense. Applewhite presented herself as an independent consultant in child sexual abuse, visiting institutes to make risk assessments and develop educational programs and policies. This included assessing how they prevented abuse, how they responded to warning signs, how they responded to disclosures of abuse, and how they remedied the situation. Applewhite was an unexpected choice of champion for the Jehovah's Witnesses because she was an active member of the Catholic Church, which the organization has repeatedly dismissed as a false religion, characterized as an enemy of true worship, criticized for its political meddling, and slated for its handling of child sexual abuse. Leaving aside the strangeness of this alliance, Applewhite's testimony was a mess. Stewart and McClellan noted that many opinions offered in her report had no source references. Applewhite said she was already fully scheduled when she started working on the report, so she hadn't been conscientious about her citations. In fact, what emerged from Applewhite's report and testimony was that her so-called expert evidence consisted of browsing online material from the organization's own website and speaking to staff from its legal branch. She said she hadn't reviewed any specific cases and couldn't offer any opinion on whether the implementation of the organization's policies had resulted in law-abiding responses, good practice of child protection, or compassionate care. As Stewart noted, all she'd basically done was a documentary review. Applewhite showed a distinct lack of awareness of the power relationship between elders and congregation members, erroneously stating that elders were merely viewed as fellow workers by the congregation. As Stewart pointed out, elders were very clearly characterized by the organization as shepherds over the flock. Their privilege and authority was reinforced by the belief that elders were directly appointed by the Holy Spirit, another fact of which she was unaware. Applewhite stated there was no requirement for elders or ministerial servants to be alone with children, but Stewart produced a branch document directed to all elders, stating that elders and ministerial servants are put in a position of trust that explicitly included being more liberal about leaving children in their care. Applewhite was also unaware of the fact that abused children were cautioned not to reveal facts about the congregation in group therapy. The only stipulation she had heard in regards to therapy was that the organization recommended choosing someone who respected their religious beliefs. As the facts about the actual experience of abused individuals emerged, Applewhite began to withdraw some of her poorly considered support for the organization. She announced that if it turned out that people had to confront their abusers and had to sit in a room with no support, that would not meet the standards of care. She conceded she hadn't understood that that was the process. Applewhite stated that when somebody abuses, and their internal mechanisms of control had allowed them to cross that line once, she didn't have confidence in those internal mechanisms of control for the future. As such, she suggested that the risk of reoffence was great, and agreed that positive steps needed to be taken to ensure that such a person didn't have access or the opportunity to abuse again. She said there should be strong and cooperative relationships with child protection authorities, but had no awareness of the difficult relationship the Jehovah's Witness organization had with secular authorities. The Commission didn't consider that Applewhite's report had assisted their inquiry, and rejected her opinions on numerous grounds, including lack of evidence or citations, but most damningly, because she had failed to investigate the experiences of a single survivor of child sexual abuse whose complaint was dealt with by the Jehovah's Witness organization. By the end of this first case, the Royal Commission had already gathered confirmation of unthinkable negligence, deeply inappropriate and traumatizing procedures, and a cover-up mentality that elevated reputation far above the protection of children and led to the use of shaming tactics on abused individuals to try and silence them. From this atrocious start, things would only get worse. As I'll be showing in Part 2, shocking new levels of deception and corruption within the organization would be laid bare, including evidence that some elders had stooped to breaking their own rules in order to avoid exposing abuse.